MMA's exciting, isn't it? That's probably why you love the sport and why you're watching this video right now. The sport of MMA is full of TKOs, KOs, submission victories, and more. And while there may be the occasional Lewis v Ngannou fights where everyone gets bored to death, MMA fans can pretty much agree that those fights are somewhat of a rarity in the sport, and that most fights end in an exciting and spectacular fashion. With that being said, there are some knockouts that are a cut above the rest, where fighters gave a bit more than they usually do, resulting in a spectacular knockout that left fans standing with their mouths agape. Hey, this is MMA EDGE, and today we'll be counting down the top 5 most spectacular knockout victories in the UFC. Number 5. Gabriel Gonzaga versus Mirko Cro Cop. Any long-time MMA fan will instantly recognize both Gabriel Gonzaga and Mirko Cro Cop. And while both fighters have had their fair share of spectacular wins inside the octagon, few can argue that Gonzaga's over-the-top win over Cro Cop in UFC 70 was definitely the Brazilian's best win yet. Gonzaga's legs honestly look like street lampposts, and if you've got a guy kicking you in the head with legs as big as those, you know you're in trouble. That was exactly the case for Mirko Cro Cop in his first bout against Gabriel Gonzaga, as the Brazilian surprised him with a devastating head kick that instantly felled the decorated kickboxer. Cro Cop was probably expecting Gonzaga to take him down and showcase his jiu-jitsu skills, which proved to be a fatal mistake for the Croatian. Cro Cop inevitably let his guard down, probably expecting a takedown, only to have his head almost taken off when Gonzaga kicked him in the head with those lamppost legs of his. Simply imagine a guy who's got legs as big as street lampposts and combine it with the agility of a 140-pound Taekwondo black belt, and you get Gabriel Gonzaga's infamous head kick KO win over Mirko Cro Cop. Not only was the win one of the most spectacular knockouts in the history of the UFC, but it was also a symbolic statement from Gonzaga showing everyone in the world just how good he was by beating Cro Cop in his own game. Number 4. Matt Hughes versus Carlos Newton. Matt Hughes was often said to be one of the greatest pound-for-pound fighters back in his day, and this fight certainly proves that statement. Hughes had already won several bouts leading up to his fight with Carlos Newton in UFC 34, and he wasn't about to let anyone stop his momentum. Newton was a UFC and MMA pioneer himself, who'd shown his skills inside and outside of the cage time and time again. In fact, Newton was so good at fighting that he was one of the few fighters who was successful at both Pride and the UFC, a feat that most fighters wouldn't be able to accomplish at the time. The fight between Newton and Hughes was setting itself up to be a great one, although no one had really expected it to go down the way it did that night. And while everyone in the MMA community had already known about Matt Hughes' infamous powerbomb slams, no one really thought he was going to be able to actually use the move against someone like Carlos Newton. Hughes ultimately proved everyone wrong though, as he lifted Newton up from his guard and eventually slammed the Ronin down onto the hard mat in a move that looked suspiciously similar to what they call a powerbomb in professional wrestling. Hughes' spectacular KO win over Newton was not only an amazing show of superhuman strength on his part, but was also proof that pro wrestling isn't as fake as most people say it is. Nah, I'm just kidding. Pro wrestlers are definitely fake. But one thing is for sure though, the slams and the power bombs, those aren't. They definitely hurt. Number 3. Anthony Pettis versus Stephen Thompson. Fighters don't often come as crazy as Anthony Pettis. Having some of the most spectacular wins in the history of MMA under his name, Showtime has shown fighters and fans alike, time and time again, that you can still be flashy while racking up those wins inside the cage. His most recent example of this would be Pettis' stunning victory against one of the greatest 170-pounders in the history of MMA, Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. Pettis walked into this fight as a plus 350 underdog, fresh out of the lightweight pool and into the 170 pond. Yet he ended the bout in a way that no one ever thought he could. It was as if Pettis wanted to tell everyone, nah, a ninja-like head kick while running off the side of the cage ain't enough. That ain't nothing. Watch this. To be fair to Wonderboy though, it actually seemed that if he was clearly winning the first 2 rounds and Pettis didn't look like he had an answer to Thompson's relentless karate kicks, not to mention the clear reach advantage he had against him. However, Pettis simply remained calm and stuck to his plan, chopping down Thompson's legs and ultimately limiting his mobility inside the cage. Thompson's greatest weapon has always been his quick feet, and once Pettis had taken that away, Showtime simply pulled another page from his book by ending the fight with a spectacular knockout via a Superman punch that had everyone screaming their lungs out. If Pettis' KO win against the heavy favorite Stephen Thompson wasn't a spectacular knockout, I honestly don't know what is. Number 2, Alistair Overeem versus Francis Ngannou. Ngannou has gained a reputation of being one of the scariest knockout artists the UFC has ever seen, and this fight is probably the reason why. And while Overeem has been knocked out before by the likes of Travis Brown and Chuck Liddell, no one's ever really destroyed him the way Ngannou did in their fight at UFC 218. Besides, Overeem was never an opponent you could easily knock out either. Only the best heavyweights have been able to take down this giant, especially since Overeem's also had his own fair share of KO wins under his belt. None of that mattered to Francis Ngannou though, after nearly decapitating the former K1 Grand Prix champion with a vicious uppercut that could have sent anyone else's head flying throughout the arena. Did you actually see Overeem's face after being knocked out? Was he looking at a ghost? Or was he staring at outer space? Nope. It was just Francis Ngannou almost taking off his head with his inhuman power. Number 1, Edson Barboza versus Terry Etim. Edson Barboza is a lot like Anthony Pettis, only on gorilla steroids. Whatever the heck gorilla steroids are supposed to be, but who cares? It sounds really cool, and so is Barboza's spectacular knockout win over Terry Etim. I also bet a lot of you aren't surprised to see Edson Barboza on the top of this list. After all, Barboza has had a reputation of being one of the most spectacular kickers in the history of MMA. England's rising star in Terry Etim, however, didn't think too much of Barboza's fancy kicks. Etim, in fact, had some pretty fancy kicks of his own, and he was pretty sure that his striking arsenal would overpower Barboza's. That never turned out to be the case though, as Barboza ultimately ended the bout with a statement by landing a spinning back kick that landed so flush on Etim's face that his head almost flew off. To Etim's credit, he actually looked pretty good for the most part of the first round against Barboza, at least until the Brazilian started landing some vicious kicks on Etim's legs and body. Barboza's absolutely fantastic and spectacular win over Etim via his patented spinning back kick landed him the number 1 spot on our countdown today. And that's it for today's video. Make sure to leave a like, smash that subscribe button, and comment if you haven't already for more epic mixed martial arts content.